I'd like to go back to the second argument that is often made to side with Russia or in favor of Russia. And this is typically when the Monroe Doctrine gets quoted. And the Monroe Doctrine basically states that no distant great power is allowed to place any of its military forces into the Western Hemisphere, right? This is a US doctrine. Example is if Canada or Mexico were to invite the Chinese into their country, set up a military base, the US wouldn't be too happy about it. And I've made this argument myself, I'll be honest. However, neither Canada nor Mexico fear their neighbor, right? So why would they invite a foreign military presence into their country? So does this argument really hold any value?
Well, the point is that sometimes our neighbors in the Western Hemisphere fear us. The reason that Toronto is not the capital of Canada and Ottawa is the capital of Canada is that Toronto was too close to the American border, and the British, who ran Canada in the 19th century, were fearful that we would invade Canada and we would take the capital, which was Toronto. So they made Ottawa the capital. And there are all sorts of canals and military fortifications still existing in Ottawa that are left over from the days when the Canadians feared.
But that's a long time ago.
Well, the point is that times change, right? Look at Cuba. Look at Venezuela today, right? In World War I, the United States was worried about the Germans forming a military alliance with the French. The Mexicans forming a military alliance with the Germans. It might have been a long time ago. The point is, the United States does not want any country in the Western Hemisphere to invite a distant great power in with its military forces. Whether Canada is going to do that or Mexico is going to do that is largely irrelevant. We just don't want anybody to do it, period, because it's a threat to our survival. This is where I started off describing realism. Realism operates on the assumptions that great powers are very sensitive about their survival. They worry greatly about their neighbors doing things that can threaten their security. And what the Russians are saying with regard to Ukraine is that we effectively have a Monroe Doctrine. We do not want this alliance, which was our mortal enemy in the Cold War, coming up to our border. We do not want American military forces in Ukraine. We don't want missiles and planes and troops from NATO in Ukraine.
But they are already existent in the Baltic states. So it's not like they don't exist on Russia's border. Like foreign military forces.
Ukraine is different. Ukraine is a much bigger piece of real estate, and it represents a much more threatening situation to Russia than the Baltic states.
Do you think the Baltic states are threatened by Russia?
No.
They feel threatened.
Of course they do.
And if you argue for how Russia feels or how they perceive NATO and not how NATO sees itself, then wouldn't we have to understand that the small Baltic countries feel threatened by Russia?
I think from the Baltic states' point of view, from Ukraine's point of view, and from Poland's point of view, and from Romania's point of view, just to pick a handful of countries, it makes perfect sense to want to be in NATO and have an Article 5 guarantee, effectively from the United States. I fully understand that. The problem is, from a Russian perspective, it would be best if none of those countries were in NATO. The Russians were not powerful enough to stop Romania, Poland, and the Baltic states from getting into NATO. But Ukraine is a different matter. Ukraine is much more important strategically to the Russians, right, than those other countries are. And furthermore, the Russians are now powerful enough to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO.